One can see someone engaging in the activity of thinking about something, and one can see that they are engaged in that particular activity. However, the fact that one can see the mental action and the fact that the individual is engaged in this mental action does not give one the license to see the mental events that constitute the action itself. For instance, one sees a chess player deliberate over their next move, but one does not see the individual mental events that deliberation consists in. So thus, we can reasonably say that episodes of conscious thought are considered private to the thinker. That these events are private to the thinker doesn't mean that this view is in tension with the idea that conscious episodes are identical with physical or neural events that could in principle be observed. However, even supposing we could observe these physical/neural events, it's not clear that we could, from the observation of these events, discern the particular cognitive events as such that make up the thinker's episode of conscious thought. If each of the subject's mental events is token identical with some brain event, then why not grant that there is a sense in which that subject can perform bodily actions, insofar as these brain events are, in some sense, bodily events that are intentional under some description. Characterizing the case this way would appear to collapse any distinction between mental and bodily actions, since if mental events are identical with physical events, then all mental actions are in fact physical actions. Yet something about this characterization immediately strikes us as a little odd. For instance, from a first-person point of view, given a description of an intentional mental action, like say solving a mathematics problem, you might be completely unaware of what sort of bodily events, say punching in the numbers on a calculator, the action actually involves. These points give us reason to think that in the case of a subject who's only capable of performing actions that involve the activity of conscious thinking, there won't be the kind of connection between the subject's mental life and observable body behavior that is characteristic of the physicalist approach to mentality, even though each of these subjects' conscious thoughts might be identical with some bodily, in this case neural, event. So do these sorts of considerations give us reason to think that the sense in which the activity of conscious thinking is private to its subject is in tension with the physicalist approach to mentality? The physicalists need not commit themselves to the idea that mental action reduces to bodily action. The physicalist can instead hold that a person's inner mental life will necessarily be anchored in publicly observable behavior that expresses the person's inner mental life. According to this sort of view, what is it for such a mental process to be an instance of conscious thinking as opposed to non-conscious mental process? There are reasons for thinking that conscious thinking cannot simply be a matter of there being a process that results in the acquisition of a personal level mental state, for instance, a belief, desire, or intention. Such aspects of mind, personal level mental states, can be non-conscious states, which are sometimes labeled as non-occurrent. Think of them as being the kinds of features of the mind that can persist during dreamless sleep. And there seems to be no reason to deny that an event that is the acquisition of such a non-conscious state can also be non-conscious. This suggests that there is no reason to think that we cannot make sense of the existence of a non-conscious process constituted by a series of non-conscious events that are simply changes to, or acquisitions of, non-conscious personal level mental states. Although such processes would affect an agent's personal level mental states, that would not suffice for them being instances of conscious thinking. This suggests that we should look to higher order theories of consciousness. If we take a higher order approach for some mental action, say consciously judging that P, where P is some proposition such as it is raining, what should we say about the object of that higher order awareness's ontological category? One straightforward view is that when one consciously judges that P, one is in a higher order state that represents the fact that one believes that P. In other words, judging that P just is believing that one believes that P. So my conscious judging that it is raining means that I just believe that I believe it's raining. But there's something odd about this view. Even if the above view is correct, there's no reason to think that my belief about what I believe ceases to obtain when I am not consciously judging that P, any more than my base level belief that P ceases to obtain when I am not consciously judging that P. In plainer terms, neither my belief that it is raining nor my belief that I believe it is raining stops existing after I finish my judgment that it is raining. One way around this is to argue that the object of higher order awareness is not a mental state like belief, but rather something like a mental event or episode. But this view leaves us with a number of questions about the object's ontological status. For instance, on this view, when you judge that it's raining, is the mental event one that unfolds over time? Most of us have the intuition that our mental life takes the form of a stream of consciousness. Our thoughts are always flowing from one to the next. But the philosopher Geach argued against this view. According to Geach, thoughts do not unfold in classic stream of consciousness style we've come to expect, but rather are individuated by their propositional content in a kind of non-successive unity that lacks gradual transition. For instance, if I think about getting eaten by a tiger and then next think about getting eaten by a bear, there's no period of transition from my thought of getting eaten by a tiger to my thought of getting eaten by a bear. So in sum, Soteriou is rejecting the idea that the act of thinking is a mental act of judging the P that is filling an interval of time that can be broken down into sub-intervals of time, in each where there occurs a temporal part of that mental act that is to be specified in terms of the propositional content that P is judged. In plainer terms, when judges that it is raining, you first judge it, then is, and finally raining over some span of time to produce the complete thought it is raining. But this doesn't seem right. The act of judging is not like putting together a jigsaw puzzle in the sense of taking discrete parts and fashioning them into something whole. Soteriou comes to the conclusion that the act of judging the P is an achievement, an event that is the acquisition of a mental state. According to Soteriou's view, an act of judging is an instantaneous event with no internal structure, but where the state it is the acquisition of is individuated by something that has structure, namely its propositional content. But if judging that P is indeed the acquisition of a certain mental state and thus itself has no temporal duration, how does this play with the idea that consciously judging the P is a higher order state that takes the mental act of judging as its object? In plainer terms, if the acquisition of the mental state in question is instantaneous, how do we explain our awareness of this act? If we regard the higher order state as a belief and take the acquisition of this belief as our object, we're left with a rather confusing picture. If the higher order belief concerns an object, our judging that P, and this object lacks temporal extension, we might think that our higher order belief also lacks temporal extension, and it seems deeply unintuitive to think this about beliefs. If we go the other way and deny that higher order beliefs have present tense content and are thus just the beliefs that one has acquired the belief that P, we're left with a picture where awareness is not conscious awareness but rather belief. This seems deeply unintuitive. When I look through the window and see that it is raining and thus judge that it is raining, I don't seem to just believe that it is raining. Rather, I know and am aware that it is raining. So it seems like the higher order thought is in a bit of trouble here. One way to get out of this trouble is to argue, as the philosopher Christopher Peacock does, that the higher order state we're dealing with is a belief-independent state of awareness. Peacock's model argues that what allows us to know our own actions are belief-independent events of what he terms action awareness, which carry the form, I am doing such and such now. Peacock's model argues that this action awareness is standardly brought about by an event of trying that causes the action that the action awareness represents. And in that distinctive way in which a subject comes to know of her own actions is by taking such an apparent action awareness at face value. So, for Peacock, the distinctive way in which a subject comes to know that C is judging that P is by taking at face value an action awareness with the content I am judging that P. Sounds well and good, but are there any problems with this proposal? Soteriou argues that they are, and they can be illustrated by pointing to our perceptual experience of instantaneous events. When you see something like a ship disappearing over the horizon, the event of the object disappearing happens at a time, but it does not take time. The perception of the event of the instantaneous disappearance of an object appears to entail both the perception of the object and its absence. One's perception of the object prior to its disappearance, and one's perception of the scene after the object's disappearance. If you perceive the instantaneous event of the disappearance of the object, then your perception of that event must also have been a perception of the object in its absence. And so your perception of the instantaneous event requires the perception of something that isn't instantaneous. It requires the perception of something, in this case the scene before you, enduring for an interval of time that spans both the presence of the object and its absence. In general, perceptual awareness of an instantaneous event requires awareness of an interval of time during which some instantaneous change occurs, for it requires awareness of how things are before and after the change occurs. Should we likewise hold that when consciously judges the P, one is in a belief-independent state of awareness that represents how things are before and after some instantaneous event of change occurs? If so, what is the relevant event of change? Is it the acquisition of a belief? This would lead to the proposal that when consciously judges that P, one is in a belief-independent state of awareness that represents one's not having the belief that P, and then one's having the belief that P. And one might worry about positing a belief-independent state of awareness that represents the absence of a belief as well as its obtaining. So it looks like for Soteriou there are some serious problems with the bottom-up higher-order picture of judging the P. So what does Soteriou think is the right picture? The answer for Soteriou is to appeal to what he calls an occurrent mental state. The obtaining of this state is constitutively dependent on the occurrence of a conscious mental event with temporal extension. So the occurrence of a conscious mental event with temporal extension is necessary for one to know that one is judging at P, given that it is necessary for the obtaining of a belief that one is judging at P. Moreover, the conscious event with temporal extension is a vehicle of a mental act of judging that P only if the belief that one is judging that P obtains when that event occurs. So the belief that one is judging that P is not a belief that one acquires after the occurrence of the conscious event as a result of interpreting that one is thinking, in this case judging, at P. So this reintroduces into the account of conscious judging a higher order state of belief that concerns an act of judging, but although higher order beliefs play a role in this account of conscious judging, note that this is not a version of a bottom-up approach to conscious thought, for it does not hold that such conscious mental acts involve events of a kind that can occur without being conscious and which simply require further higher order states to represent them in order for them to be conscious. So for Soteriou, the mental act of judging that P is neither a purely bottom-up approach nor a belief-independent approach, but rather a kind of hybrid, taking the parts that work for both theories and grafting them together into something new. I myself have a few issues with this framework. For one thing, I question how it is that on the higher order model of belief outlined above, just because the object of our higher order belief lacks temporal extension, our higher order belief itself also lacks this property. That doesn't seem right to me. I can buy to a certain extent the notion that judging that P lacks temporal extension, but it seems weird to say that because the mental event of judging that P lacks temporal extension, this automatically entails that our higher order belief does. If I look out the window and see that it's raining, and from there I think it's raining, and I'm aware of thinking this thought that it is raining, it seems to me that I can play around and form different higher order beliefs on that initial judgment. Is it really raining, or is someone just running a sprinkler on the roof? These branching judgments, while different from my original higher order belief, nevertheless take that initial belief as its object. For them to take that initial belief as its object, the original higher order thought needs to have some kind of temporal extension. At least on my reading of things it does. If nothing else, this is just food for thought.